Hello, and welcome to a discussion of CMMC practice descriptions and assessment procedures. The topic we're covering today is a lesson from a curriculum for individuals who want to become Certified CMMC Assessors, or CCA. The exam a CCA takes has several knowledge areas. This is from Domain 4, the CMMC Level 2 practices. For those who may be watching this earlier in your learning about CMMC, there are a lot of acronyms on this slide and more in the presentation. If you're not already familiar with the ones here, just hang in there, please, until slide number 4, and then we'll cover some of the main ones you're likely to see. Hi, I'm Linda Rust. Just a couple of sentences about my background before we dive in, so you know where I'm coming from as we make our way through this material. My journey to be with you here today started with a computer engineering degree, followed by many years of running large-scale mission-critical projects, mostly in Fortune 500 enterprises. 10 years ago, I just so happened to land in a cybersecurity project, the nature of which was to help one of the larger prime contractors to the Department of Defense become compliant with what is now the foundation of CMMC. 10 years on, I'm still an external advisor to the CISO. CMMC became my pandemic project, because it seems to take the accountability of third-party assessment to get many organizations motivated to address cybersecurity at all. While my anchor client is in a strong position for CMMC, their supply chain is another matter. I'm here to help CMMC scale for the defense industrial base. So let's get going. Our agenda today is to describe the elements of a CMMC practice description, to describe how an assessment procedure is formed from a practice description, and to explain CMMC methods and objects. We're not going to get very far without acronyms. This table is an attempt to capture the ones that occur on the slides for this module. I want to point out one of my favorites. It's the JGJGP, or the jargon generating juggernaut of gigantic proportions. With CMMC as it is at the intersection of defense, IT, and cybersecurity, the alphabet soup flies fast and furious. It's important to have both a sense of humor and some empathy about this. Now, I'm not going to read this slide. In class, it's something on which we spend time and discuss, but I'm trying to keep this a fairly short video. So if you want some more time with it, excuse me, please hit the pause and take a moment to check out this slide or to download the handout from the Secure Think Field Notes blog post. If you want even more support with acronyms, the CMMC documentation on the DoD website has a 40-page glossary, and the last 4 or 5 pages of that is a list of more acronyms that you might find useful. In the CCA course, we look at a lot of practice descriptions, all 110 of them at level 2 before the class is done. The purpose of this lesson is to speed things up by looking at the underlying patterns we see again and again across all of them. I had watched deeply experienced people work with these materials, and it all just clicked for them. You know, they were firing on all cylinders. They were just moving fast, and they were trying to teach me, and they were. But you know, there's a saying: a fish doesn't realize it's swimming in water. These folks had spent so many years working with these standards. They had watched the standards evolve from NIST 853 to NIST 800-171, and then ultimately to CMMC. They were intimately familiar with pretty much every corner of the standard, it seemed. And so I've come to suspect that they no longer recognize the water in which they're swimming. It turns out this material that I'm sharing with you in this module is right there in the CMMC Level 2 Assessment Guide. But a lot of folks rush right past it. This is context. Some people are only interested in content. Understanding this context is the difference between working with a knife that has a dull blade or a knife with a sharp blade. Taking time to sharpen our blades before we begin makes the job faster, cleaner, and safer in the long run. So let's sharpen our blades. This is a picture of a practice description. I have looked at one of these hundreds of times before I realized that the parts have names. It's useful to know what they are, because when you recognize the pieces, they are like plot points of a story. once you see the story, it's easier to make it your own. At the top left corner, there's a practice identification number. Now, the CMMC model names the parts that this identifier has its own parts, and that comes from the CMMC model document. So there's the domain abbreviation, and then there's the level number, and then there's the 800-171 requirement ID. At the top right, there's a short name identifier. It's so interesting that several CMMC documents say that this is to be used for quick reference only. That phrase in the parentheses, it comes right from CMMC documents, several of them actually. So I think it's kind of like a nickname where everybody knows that the child's full name is Elizabeth, and the parents make a really big deal about calling the child Elizabeth. But every once in a while, you just need to be able to say Beth. Next, we come to the practice statement. And this is the focus of the practice description. This is the heart. This is the core. Everything else in the practice description is in support of this. The next section, the assessment objectives, are clearly labeled as coming from 800-171A. The first word is determine, and that's followed by one or more determination statements. In this slide, there are 4 determination statements. And we're going to be referring to those in the next slide. These are the directions from the Level 2 assessment guide for how to get the assessment procedure from a practice description. An assessment procedure consists of an assessment objective, plus a set of potential assessment methods, plus a set of potential assessment objects. Each assessment objective has a determination statement, and determination statements are linked to the content of the practice. Okay, so on the one hand, that's kind of clear, and there's kind of a flow, but to me, this is still a wall of words. And this is how I had to take it apart to see the important pieces. Now I can see more clearly what the pieces are and how they flow from one to another. So here it's just more clear that we have an assessment procedure, one important component of which is the assessment objectives. And there's some other stuff, and we'll get to that later on. But that assessment objective connects to the determination statement, and the determination statement flows to the practice. So as I was seeing the flow here, another picture formed in my mind immediately, and it was this. So now I see how the dots connect and how the practice connects to the assessment objective and the assessment procedure. So let's revisit how this part actually looks in each practice statement, or I'm sorry, practice description in the assessment guide. This is a screenshot from the Level 2 assessment guide, and oof, I mean, my eyes just cross, a wall of words, at least for me. So this is how I had to take it apart to see the important pieces. First, I noticed this particular practice description is about role-based risk awareness. And I didn't pick this for any particular reason, actually. It just happened to be the first one I picked to analyze this way. I focus on the practice statement because, like I just said, that's the focus, that's the core of the practice description. I put a purple box around the action that the OSC, the organization seeking certification. I put a purple box around the action the OSC needs to take. And that action is that certain people are made aware. Okay, so who has to be made aware? And of what? I put an orange box around the who. Managers, system administrators, and users. Okay, so what do these folks need to be made aware of? Turns out there are 2 topics. I used a blue box to outline the first topic, and that says security risks associated with their activities. I used a green box to outline the second topic, applicable policies, standards, and procedures. Okay, so now I see the key ingredients of the practice statement. Remember what we're doing. We're following the trail from how we get from this practice statement to the assessment procedure. Okay, now we've put the assessment objectives back on the slide. And notice it ultimately takes those key ingredients and recombines them. But humor me, it's going to go easier on all of us if we start at the bottom of this slide. Notice that the purple box in the assessment objective C and D at the bottom of the slide both say made aware. Now, this matches the language in the practice statement exactly. Notice that the purple box on the first two assessment objectives has a different action. Those say identify. So I had to think about that. Well, I guess it makes sense that before the OSC can make people aware of something, they have to identify the subject about which they're raising awareness. And as assessors, we need to be mindful that the subject is identified by the OSC and not by us. Furthermore, assessment objective A gets even more specific than did the practice statement. We're absolutely focusing on CUI, or controlled unclassified information. See the red circle? So the blue box is more specifically security risks associated with organizational activities involving CUI. Okay, now we've located the key ingredients and we can connect the dots. At the simplest level, the blue and the green box each contain a topic about which certain people are to be made aware. Assessment objective A says to identify the subject in the blue box. Assessment objective B says to identify the subject in the green box. The orange box contains the list of people we need to make aware of these topics. Assessment objective C says to make that list of people aware of the subject in the blue box. Assessment objective D says to make that list of people aware of the subject in the green box. Now, not all practice descriptions are exactly this tidy. The words don't always get used and reused quite this clearly. Just like we had to think things through to go from the language of made aware to the language of identify, lots of practice descriptions and practice statements will have some of that going on for the assessment objectives. But there's always a plot to the story. The assessment objectives and determination statements are like plot points that break down the story. And that story always ends up coming together in a coherent plot, and it always ends up at the practice statement. I have to go through this exercise again and again to see these patterns. Now, those very savvy people that I've worked with in this space, it turns out this is exactly what they do, because if you listen to them carefully, this is exactly how they talk about it. It's just they're doing it so quickly that it's a blur, kind of like a superhero in some animation, you know? I mean, they're just moving so fast. I just had to slow down and take it apart for it to make sense to me. Okay, so now we've done a deep dive on how that big blue arrow is created between the assessment objective and the practice description. But returning back to these directions, the assessment procedure still requires two more elements. In addition to the assessment objective, we need some assessment methods and some assessment objects. Now, let me point out this topic of methods and objects is an important one. Check out the CCA exam blueprint, which will soon be made a public document. At the time I'm making this video, it is not yet public, but it will be soon. And go check it out, because you're probably going to see this topic on it. And anyone who's planning to take the CCA exam should listen up. This is not a good time to get distracted. If you have seen the CMMC assessment guide, you know this is how the methods and objects section of a practice description looks. Notice it says clearly that this section also comes directly from 800-171A. Now, this too has an underlying structure. So let's have a quick look at that. You see, we have three sections. Each section title is a potential assessment method. We have examine, interview, and test. Within each section, we see a group of potential assessment objects. Now, let's dig a little deeper. Here's what 800-171A says about assessment objects. They identify the specific items being assessed. When I thought about this, I was like, why are they making such a big deal of it? And then I went, It reminds me of my kid when she was small enough to fit in the cart at the grocery store and she was still little. She would grab stuff that got her attention, regardless of how applicable it was to the shopping list. Now, for us assessors, it's more of a suggestion list rather than a rigid shopping list, but there's still certain ideas that are the same. So basically, if I'm in the produce section and something else is in season, I can switch out the spinach for the broccoli. But we shouldn't substitute ice cream for vegetables or even put potatoes in place of the green vegetables. The guide says that there are 4 types of assessment objects. I'm sorry, this is not the guide. This is NIST 800-171. It says that there are 4 types of assessment objects. We have specifications, which 171A says are document-based artifacts. We have mechanisms, and this is the technology, the hardware, software, firmware. And we have activities, and those are actions that people do. And then it also includes individuals on the list of assessment objects because, well, it turns out we need people to make all the other things work. What we do with these objects is described by methods. As we've already seen, there are 3 methods: examine, interview, and test. The CMMC Assessment Guide points to this part in 800-171A, but then the Assessment Guide elaborates a bit more. So let's see what that has to say. Specifically about the examine method, the Assessment Guide has the same verbs as show up in 800-171A. So if we're going to examine the kinds of things we might do, are review, inspect, observe, study, and or analyze. And we do these things to an assessment object of some kind. Now, the assessment guide doesn't use the language of specifications and document-based artifacts like 800-171A does. It uses plain language and it just says documents. And then it goes on to list some common document types. Now, it takes care to repeat the note that what is in the assessment guide is not exhaustive or prescriptive. They're just trying to start us off with what I would consider a very interesting sample. The assessment guide also gives an example of the assessment object in each of the mechanism and activity categories. Now, examine is only the first of 3 methods. The other 2 methods are interviews and testing. I love what the CMMC Assessment Guide says about how documentation provides evidence of intent on the part of the OSC. Meanwhile, interviews tell us what the staff believes, and testing actually demonstrates what has and has not been done. That really nails what gives a higher degree of confidence and why it's so frequent that we use more than one method to make sure any given practice is fully in place. The guide goes on to say that interviews determine not only if practices are implemented, but also confirm that resources are committed, staff has been trained, and planning has happened. Which, you know, if you're doing interviews and they're going well, clearly those things have happened, right? But what's also important is that resources and training and planning are foundational elements that indicate that the practice can be sustained. And these aren't things that are just happening today because we're there doing the assessment. The guide also says that testing is not expected for all practices. Well, that's often the most time-consuming and most expensive way to go about gathering evidence. So if you're going to take the CCA exam, I just want to repeat what I said earlier. Know the assessment methods of examine, interview, and test. Know the general concepts around assessment objects. It's a really important area, and I would expect to see it on the exam. Here's the bottom line. Assessors are trained to decide which combination of methods and objects will provide adequate and sufficient evidence to determine whether each assessment objective has been met. For completeness, there are other sections in the CMMC Assessment Guide for each practice description. They are, first of all, a discussion section that comes directly from 800-171. Next, there is further discussion, which is material that is unique to the CMMC assessment guide. It expands more on the NIST content, and it's intended to give us more information on the practice intent. There's always an example section, or at least I think it's always. I can't recall coming across a practice description that didn't have examples. And then potential assessment considerations. These are some questions that we might ask to further explore other aspects of the practice so that we don't miss anything that's important in collecting sufficient evidence. And another section that is always part of the practice description is the key references. So it's always the requirement that comes from 800-171, and for the level 1 items, the ones that come from the FAR clause, it also cites the relevant clause in the FAR. This is all intended to give insight and guidance and support the assessor in collecting good evidence, asking good questions, and coming to accurate findings. The key reference of 800-171 can also be used by an assessor to cross-reference to the related control in 853, which is the original source document from which 800-171 was extracted. Some of the potential assessment considerations also come from the NIST Handbook 162, which is an MEP cybersecurity self-assessment handbook with some relevant content. So again, all of this is more arrows in our quiver. In the case of assessors, it's to help assessors conduct a good assessment. And in the case of OSEs, it's to help the organization be well prepared. The primary deliverable of an assessment is a report, and it contains findings associated with each practice. Now, there are 3 possible findings. Met, which is when the OSE has successfully shown that they meet the practice and that they fully implemented the practice. Not met, where the OSE has fallen short and has not managed to demonstrate that conclusively. And not applicable, for cases where the practice has been shown to not apply. The assessor's report includes statements that explain why the assessor's finding is what it is. And it also documents appropriate evidence for every single practice. Now you can see how the assessment procedure leads to this outcome, to this report, and how all the elements we just covered build on this deliverable. Now it's time to see what we can take away from this video. We're going to have 4 questions, and they get progressively more difficult. Now, if you want to maximize the usefulness of this exercise, get ready to pause the video. Okay, knowledge check question number 1. Match each method in the left column with the evidence it provides from the right column. Again, pause the video, take a moment, get your own answer, because spoiler alert, the next slide has the answer, and you're going to get a lot more out of this if you take a moment and make sure you see the extent to which you can do this by yourself. Okay, here we go. For those who have paused, we're now ready to restart. So this is how the answers map correctly. If we examine documents, we see the intent of the organization that is seeking certification. If we interview staff, we learn what personnel believe to be true. And if we watch a system demo, we establish what has and hasn't been implemented. And one slide from the material that gives the correct answer to that question is this one. Okay, on to question 2. Which of the following statements is true? Which of the following statements is false? Now, I'm not going to read them to you. If you want to take a moment to read them and determine for yourself what your answer is, please pause the video. Okay, spoiler alert, the next slide has the answer. This is your last chance to hit pause. The CMMC Assessment Guide Level 2 does not provide an exhaustive list of assessment objects. Now, one of the slides that would substantiate that being the correct answer to the question is this slide. And it clearly says, this list is not exhaustive or prescriptive. And we say that a couple of different times in the lesson. So hopefully you were able to remember that and take it with you as you complete the video. Okay, ready for the next question? Which of the following statements is true? Again, I'm not going to read them to you. Please pause the video, take some time, and decide what your answer to this is. All right, spoiler alert, the next slide has the answer. The correct answer is the CMMC Assessment Guide Level 2 provides an exhaustive list of assessment objectives. Now, this is a bit of a trick question, and I have no idea if it reflects how the real exam would be worded. As we're making this video, the real exam isn't even out yet. So this is just something I wrote myself. But the trick, if you will, is the difference between assessment objects, which were in the answer for the last question, versus assessment objectives, which are featured in the answer for this question. So let's look at one of the first slides we saw in this module. If you remember this slide, recall how the assessment objectives each have a determination statement. And this is in the assessment guide, right? This is an exhaustive list of assessment objectives. No one is going to add another one on the fly. Everybody, it has been said that the DoD is not only telling you about the tests, they are giving you the answers to the test. And this is one of the ways in which they're doing that. The list of assessment objectives in the assessment guide is exhaustive. Okay, now this question is a discussion for sure. And of course, some of you may be an OSE and not the assessor. But the question is, how might an assessor use the structure of practice definition statements, assessment objectives, determination statements, assessment methods, assessment objects, in the event an OSE pushes back on one of their findings? Well, and if you are an OSE, you can ask yourself, how would you use the same structure to constructively challenge a finding with which you don't agree? So what are your thoughts? Again, consider pausing the, consider pausing the video and giving it just a moment to gather your own thoughts, because spoiler alert, as you continue to play this video, I'm going to give you my take on it. Okay, are you ready? Are you sure you want to hear this? I'm going to give you lots of extra time to hit the pause button and think about it. Okay, here goes. In my experience, anytime there are disagreements, especially with something as important as certification, and likely with important contracts and significant money at stake, it's not unusual for emotions to come into play. One of the most effective ways to acknowledge and yet diffuse emotions and stay focused and constructive and professional, in that kind of a situation, one of the best things you can do is make the focus of the conversation less personal. Make it so it's not one person's word against another person's word. A reliable way to do that is to put attention on the process and the structure. Start with the parts that aren't negotiable, the parts that are stable and reliable. The structure of the assessment procedure with all of its parts and the practice description with all of its parts is a really great structure that we can lean into if conversations get emotional or difficult. Okay, that's it for this video and the discussion of practice descriptions and assessment procedures. Thanks for watching this far in. If you have a problem or a question about something you saw, please tell us at the email that you see on the screen. If you like what you saw, please tell everyone. For more great material from SecuriThink, sign up on our website to be notified when we publish new field notes. Follow SecuriThink or me, Linda Rust, on LinkedIn, as we'll usually announce new contact there as well. Thanks, everybody.